Hello, Garland Nixon here, hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. He's with CovertAction Magazine.com. He is well versed in the nefarious and diabolical deeds of the intelligence agencies. And today we're going to talk about some false flags. We're going to talk about the USS Liberty, and we're going to talk about some current things going on. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. And for those of you who don't know, for the few people on this planet that don't know Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, he is one of the, in my opinion, one of the foremost experts in the world on intelligence agencies, on covert actions, on the history of all of this stuff. Absolutely incredible. This is actually one of my favorite shows of the week. I have a lot of good shows, but if somebody said to me, hey, you got to point out a show that everybody has to see, I'd say this, because people learn so much from this show. Let's start here. Of course, we're going to be talking about false flags and the possibility that there may be one on the horizon. But let's go here. CovertAction Magazine. You can see it there. And just the introduction, see, we got all kind of stuff. Trump reverses trend away from the death penalty. CovertAction Magazine, there's a bullet. Make no mistake, the U.S. wants war with Iran. How about this? Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, America Committee on Foreign Relations miseducates the public and censors truth-telling. Look at this, and this is important. They got series here on the 9/11 attacks, a Biden series, Israel, Gaza, war in Ukraine. So you got all kind of series, JFK. I mean, all kind of stuff. If you want to learn 9/11, if you want to learn the truth about this, you've got truly a professional researcher and his team. CovertActionMagazine.com. It is critical that you go there. Let's get going, Jeremy. Okay, so the reason I brought up false flags, and the reason I brought up the USS Nimitz is this, and this is because there's the buzz everywhere. People are hip to the game, right? And so they've got this ship that is due to be taken out of service next year, the USS Nimitz. And it's, I guess, plodding along, trundling along towards the Middle East. And everybody's like, you got some old ship that can, barely get out of its own way going to the Middle East that you're getting ready to get. Holy moly, false flag. They blow up the ship. Oh, look what the Iranians have done. They blown up our ship. And I guess we got to go in. Let me ask you this. I'll tell you why I'm throwing this at you. We'll start with this. Because this is what you hear. Why the Americans, why we would never attack our own ship and kill our own soldiers. My understanding is you had Operation Northwoods or whatever it was, where they had planned on bombing American cities or bases, taking American planes and dressing them up as Soviet planes. So the idea, the concept that the U.S. could attack or kill their own people or allow that to be happened by the Israelis seems foreign to some people, but not me. Anyway, let's start with this. A question. Do you know of historical instances where the U.S. either actually did it or planned to attack and kill the U.S. and or its allies, such as Israel, whatever, or attack and planned to kill its own people, to harm its own people in an effort to do some devious deed, start a war, or whatever?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I teach a course in American history, and we cover this. And students have the option of doing a term paper where they can select one of these incidents. And it goes back, I think, well before this. But you have the famous incidents like the U.S. sinking of the USS Maine. That was a pretext for the U.S. intervention in the Spanish-American War and colonization of Cuba and the Philippines. And this, was an attack on the USS Maine ship in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's still mystery around that, whether that was a false flag. I mean, they tried to blame Spain for sinking the ship, but the evidence uncovered by historians was clear that Spain did not sink the ship. Now, in this case, it may have been a fire on the ship, and they reacted and used that as a pretext to accuse Spain. Although the Cubans believe that it was a false flag, it was deliberately set by Americans, and 100-something American sailors were killed, and there was great outrage. And the Hearst media, which is like a Fox type news type that dominated the media landscape at that time, is 1898. They immediately said, "Oh, Spain sunk our ship," and it stirred up emotion in people, and that we have to go to war against Spain. But really, it was a pretext, and that was a formative period in the rise of the American empire, the monstrosity that we see playing out today, all the wars and horrors. It originated in that era based on a lie that Spain had sunk the U.S. Maine and killed these sailors. Then you have the Lusitania incident in World War I. That appeared to have been a joint British-American operation to sink. The Lusitania was a civilian ship that was bringing passengers to Europe, tourists and businessmen. One of the passengers was the son of the Vanderbilt family, and the ship was sunk, and the numbers of killed was around 1,000 people got killed, including a son of the Vanderbilts. And they blamed Germany right away. They said German torpedoes sunk the ship. But then there was a British inquiry after World War I, and it uncovered that there had been explosives planted on the ship, and that there was all kinds of skullduggery that went on, that the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was told by his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who was a populist, who was trying to prevent U.S. involvement in World War I. They eventually got rid of him, but he was telling Wilson, take out an ad in the New York Times where the ship was leaving from, to tell people not to go in the ship because it's dangerous. There was a suggestion that something was going to be set up, maybe like we're hearing today, but Wilson refused to do that. And Winston Churchill was the head of the British Navy, and he deliberately, this British inquiry uncovered, and other historians have written about it, that he deliberately withheld the rescue boats so that the most people would die. So it was designed to maximize public outrage. That's the only way people will support the war. I mean, most people in regular life don't want to go to war, don't want to send their kids to war, don't want to support the war unless your country is immediately under attack. So you have to engineer these incidents, whip up hatred against an enemy, blame them for some dastardly act that was often set up by their own government. And in this case, the British were trying to draw the United States into World War I because they were losing. And also, J.P. Morgan fronted a loan to Britain and France to sustain their war, and they needed U.S. troops to come in. And Wilson was close with J.P. Morgan, so he was in on it because he wanted, Morgan was pushing him for the intervention because they needed an Allied victory so he would get repayment on his loan. And then they screwed over Germany at the Versailles Treaty. They ultimately blamed them for starting the war when that's dubious as well. So, and then you have the Pearl Harbor incident. I did a whole article, detailed research on that. That was provoked by the United States and Roosevelt administration because they couldn't tolerate, a rival empire in the Asia Pacific. Japan was developing its own empire and excuse me, expelling European, imperialism, and the United States wanted its empire in the Asia Pacific that they'd started with the Philippine conquest, and they wanted to dominate the whole region, which is rich in natural resources and seen as key to global domination. So they engineered the Pearl Harbor incident, provoked the Japanese, imposed a harsh oil embargo designed to cripple their economy, backed out of any sabotage, any diplomatic talk to the Japanese. And then they knew they had cracked the Japanese code. They knew in advance that Pearl Harbor was happening. And actually, George C. Marshall was the Army Chief of Staff. He received word. This is framed as a conspiracy theory by some historians even today, they deny that the truth about Pearl Harbor, but it's obvious because Marshall actually had, this is documented, irrefutable fact that George C. Marshall had news of the impending attack on Pearl Harbor early in the morning, which, Washington is about 7, 8 hours ahead of Hawaii time, which was in the middle of the night in Hawaii. And all he had to do is, it's not even contested that he had that information. All he had to do was pick up the scrambler phone, which was a technology they had in that time. Inexplicably, he sent a note via regular courier, which in 1939 meant a guy, it had to go by a ship or a plane, and it took all day, and it only got to the Hawaiian naval commanders well after Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And then there was a government commission that asked him, why didn't you send it via scrambler phone? That would have prevented the Pearl Harbor disaster, because they could have mobilized their air defense. And he said, well, the Germans might have seen the message. That's irrelevant. It would have saved thousands of American lives. So it's obvious, but somehow they frame it as a conspiracy theory when it's not. When the fact is clear, it's incontrovertible that Marshall had the news hours before and could have used the scrambler phone. And that's how, a lot of historians, and I have an article, Time for the beginning of the school year, I've been working on how the historian miseducate the public. And I say this September, a student go back to class, they're not going to be told the truth about U.S. history and these kind of incidents. And then the USS Liberty, I just put in the chat an article. There's good books on this topic, and we know quite a lot about it. The Israelis attacked the USS Liberty spy ship in the Middle East around the time of the 6-Day War. And there's strong evidence that this was all set up by Lyndon Johnson as a false flag operation, because Lyndon Johnson was losing in Vietnam. His political career was going into the toilet. Johnson was a very, very devious man. I have strong evidence in the article I've outlined that he was a key figure in the JFK assassination. His role in political murders go back to 1948 when he stole an election for U.S. Senate in the state of Texas, and people knew about this. In fact, the incumbent governor accused him of murders to cover it up, and there's strong evidence because there's a county in East Texas where he committed voter fraud, and this was known by the sheriff in that county, and he was speaking out, the sheriff, and going to the public with this, and Johnson had him murdered. And that's one of a number of political murders that Johnson is linked to. So he's a fundamentally immoral person. In fact, his own grandmother predicted that he would be in prison. He was a bad kid from the start. He blew up a dog in a stray town in his hometown. It indicated he had psychopathic tendencies. And so with the Liberty incident, Vietnam was becoming extremely unpopular. It was ruining him politically. And he was a gambler. He said, I'm a gambling man. And so his gamble, he was going to reclaim his prestige by winning a Middle East war and defeating the Egyptians and becoming a hero to erase what he'd done in Vietnam. So the incident was set up that it was supposed to, the Israelis carried out the attack on the USS Liberty, but it was supposed to be in disguise, and it was supposed to make to look like the Egyptians did it, because Egypt was ruled by Gamal Abdel Nasser at that time, who was a socialist pan-Arabist. He was trying to unify Arab countries under a socialist system and take control of oil to develop Arab countries into strong countries capable of resisting Western imperialism. And he had nationalized the Suez Canal and stood up to the British, French, and Israelis when they tried to invade it in 1956. And the U.S. government had been trying to overthrow Nasser, and they even sent in the coup master Kermit Roosevelt after he had overthrown Mossadegh in Iran. However, they failed to unseat Nasser, who was very popular. So then they used the Israelis, the kind of pit bull in the 6-Day War. They delivered a pretty crushing blow. But Johnson's plan was to set up this incident where it would look like the Egyptians attacked an American spy ship and destroyed the ship. And that would be a pretext to escalate the 6-Day War, because this was at the beginning days of that 6-Day War. So this would give a pretext for a further escalation where the United States would directly send troops and fully wipe out Nasser. And this would be heroic and restore Johnson's prestige and save his presidency, because he had to resign by early 68 because he was so unpopular. But it went wrong because they didn't destroy the ship fully. They did kill, I forget the numbers of American sailors that were killed. A considerable number were killed and injured, but it didn't entirely destroy the ship, and there were a lot of survivors. And then the Israelis blew their cover. It became evident that it was an Israeli helicopter that attacked the ship, so it ruined the false flag. It was a botched false flag operation, and then they had to develop excuses about why this happened, and they claimed it was a mistake. But the Israelis made a mistake, but we know that that's not the case. I think this was so that answers your question. Yeah, they've done this many, many times. And yeah, they may use, Israel is the proxy of the United States in the Middle East, and they'll use them, and then they'll blame them. Since this covert operation went wrong, they could then blame, make various excuses, and ultimately try and blame the Israelis. And it fuels hatred toward the Israelis, which, I mean, they were willing participants, so they were complicit. At least the elite levels of the Israeli high command who knew what was going on there.
Just real quick before I get to my next question, and that is, we're talking with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. Great, absolutely. It's CovertActionMagazine.com, exposing covert action since 1978. Absolutely incredible work that they do. I mean, you name it, they're on top of it. And you go to their series right here where they got series on 9/11, Biden, Israel, Gaza war. How about that? There's a series on that. Political assassinations, prison industrial complex, war in Ukraine, you name it, they're on top of it. Go to CovertActionMagazine.com. It's one of my favorite resources, and I would commend that you check it out. By the way, tell us a little bit of the history of Covert Action Magazine for our new viewers.
Sure, yeah, and I sent in the chat this article I did on the USS Liberty, so if you have a chance, people can check out that article. It was published a few years ago. As far as the magazine, yeah, this magazine, well, I actually discovered it as a graduate student. I was doing research on U.S. foreign policy in Southeast Asia and the CIA. So I was at the National Archive going through the CIA's CREST file of historical documents. And, the CIA and this magazine kept coming up, Covert Action Information Bulletin. And that was the stuff, most of the CIA document, because, they keep classified the revealing documents. And actually, I was recently at the archive last summer, and an archivist who worked there a long time told me, I visited with him, and he said, well, there's a room in the CIA with about 1 million documents, and, the really important documents. And it's like got the most heavy security. It's the most heavily fortified room. And it's like those documents are never going to see the light of day until all of us and our kids and maybe our grandkids are dead. Maybe then after our grandkids are passed away, maybe. But so I mean, it's boring reading CIA document because they just release the junk. But mixed in was the Covert Action Information Bulletin, because they were monitoring it, and that was the really good stuff. That was like exciting to read. I mean, they were hard-hitting exposés of the CIA, and when it started, they had a naming names column where they outed CIA agents. Because this was a magazine founded in the late 70s by Philip Agee, who was a CIA whistleblower, who wrote the book Inside the Company, a CIA diary, which is a kind of tell-all account of his life in the CIA and a lot of the nefarious things they were doing, including involvement in coups in South America and supporting torture. What turned him off was that he had been working with police in Uruguay, and like he was having a meeting with the police chief, and he heard screams in the next room of prisoners being tortured, and the chief was like, "Oh, I'm going to turn up the soccer match so we don't hear that." And AG, was like, oh, felt bad because he realized that those people had been arrested because he had worked with the police to develop these blacklists and to apprehend them, and now they were being subjected to brutal tortures, and he couldn't stomach it. So yeah, he founded this magazine with Lou Wolf, worked in the underground media in the Vietnam War. He had been a voluntary worker in Laos, and he uncovered that the CIA was running a huge covert operation and training, running its own tribal army among a minority group, the Hmong, and it was tearing up Laos and all the lies that awakened him politically. So he worked in underground. In that era, there was a lot of underground newspapers and media, some run by disaffected U.S. GIs in the Vietnam War. So Lou Wolf worked in that, and then teamed up with Phil Agee to form this magazine to expose the CIA and the nefarious things it was doing. And it had some really good exposés and articles about CIA conduct in many different countries in the world. And Agee viewed the CIA as a group of traitors because they were violating U.S. law, violating the Constitution, and he considered them traitors to the United States, and that was his responsibility to expose who these people were. So yeah, they placed a value on actually identifying CIA agents in the early days of the magazine, but then new laws were passed that made it more difficult to do that, put more pressure on them. So eventually that column was disbanded, but the magazine has survived and still has a mission of trying to expose covert operations and just provide general critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy, because Agee was kind of unique among whistleblowers in that he developed a deep political economic analysis of U.S. imperialism and how U.S. corporations were the ones driving these misdeeds. And so the magazine continues to, while it is difficult to expose the CIA as an agency, because since they operate in secrecy, and we don't have that many resources. Even if we had the resources, it's very difficult to report on a secret agency that doesn't disclose what they're doing.
Well, I tell you, you guys do a heck of a job of it. I tell you that much.
But we
You guys
try,
do.
yeah, and we provide critical analysis that often the mainstream, even alternative media, doesn't always provide good analysis of what is at the root of these nefarious operations, the political economic dimensions, the role that U.S. corporations and Wall Street have played, like in Ukraine conflict is just one example. We've had articles about the Wall Street attempt to take over the Ukrainian economy and the political economic dimension. So you find a lot of articles on that, as well as covert operations. And yeah, since I'm a historian, I have a series on the history, trying to reveal the history of the CIA. Like last week, we had a discussion about an article I did on Japan in the post-World War II period. So we do a lot of historical articles, and I think it's important to illuminate that dark history as we're doing today, so people can see the patterns. If you know that these false flags have existed repeatedly throughout history, they're trying them again. The only way we can stop that is if more and more people are conscious of what they're doing. Then we can call it out as it happens, and it won't work. So
Well, you know what's interesting too. We're talking today. We're talking about the issue of false flags, particularly in the context of the USS Nimitz, which is some old rust bucket, which they're now positioning in the near the ongoing conflict, and many of us suspect that an Iranian missile may find its way to the Nimitz. They got 3,000 people on there. They'll blow them to smithereens, and they wouldn't think twice. And I tell you what, that number 3,000. And we've been talking about Pearl Harbor, and it's important for people who are like, these people are just crazy conspiracy theorists. Why the government would never kill? I had somebody tell me the other day, and I'm like, yeah, they blow that ship to smithereens in a second. They're like, no, now they go far, but they wouldn't kill their own soldiers. I'm like, okay. So here's the first thing I thought of. Let's be honest. When I think of Pearl Harbor now, you know what I think of? I think of the Project for the New American Century, PNAC, which were a bunch of ultra-Zionist, neocon, warmongers, but I repeat myself. Because one of the things that they had said in writing prior to 9/11 was, we need another Pearl Harbor. And what do you know? There's an old saying, speak of the devil and he shall appear, right? Okay. We need another Pearl Harbor. Whoa, 9/11. Isn't that? What are your thoughts on that concept? The evidence that 9/11 was a false flag, that 9/11, that they had called for it, that everything was set up. Let me add one more thing. The what would they call that thing? The Patriot Act. There was like 300 and some pages that popped up a few days after 9/11. And I'm like, so I'm supposed to believe that they wrote this damn thing in 6 days? Anyway, your thoughts on the evidence that you've seen that 9/11, that there was pre-planning, that this was some kind of a false flag, that, anyway, your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I think there's a whole lot of evidence. There's a lot of books that have been written on this topic, and I think people in the mainstream shy away from this topic. Academics, they don't want to associate with a conspiracy theory, but I think if you want to really get at the truth, you have to sometimes put yourself out there. I mean, yeah, these books, are very detailed. I mean, there's just so many things that they expose. I mean, one of the CIA, Al Qaeda. I mean, a number of the hijackers had connections with the CIA in the past. So, I mean, that's just one thing. I mean, there's so many things that we have to have a whole show to talk about it. But off the top of my head, I mean, even stuff with Mohammed Atta, the supposed lead hijacker, very suspicious on a number of levels. I mean, one is that somehow his passport survived the fiery air crash. I mean, that is impossible. But then they were also creating a legend. Like, see, one thing, since I've studied like the JFK assassination and studied the history of the CIA just by reading a lot of books on this topic, you see how the CIA operate. Like, they create a legend with Oswald. They had him arrested deliberately, and they wanted him associated with the Fair Play for Cuba committee, so they can label him as a left-wing communist, and that he was behind this. And with Atta also, there were outbursts he made. Like, if he was actually a hijacker, he wouldn't engage in like a public outburst to get attention. And like, he publicly, made these extreme statements. And then there were Atta doubles. Another feature of an intelligence operation is to have doubles. So you had Oswald. There were 3 different Oswalds seen just on the day of the JFK assassination, and then there are Oswalds all over Mexico City before, and excuse me. So it's an indication of a covert operation. And the same with Timothy McVeigh. I did another study, and I live in Oklahoma. And actually, I was as naive as anybody else. Like, when I moved to Oklahoma, and I've lived here a while now. So gradually, I talked to people just in regular conversations. Somehow the bombing would come up, and they would tell me things. People who had been there, and they'd say, no, there were 2 blasts. It couldn't have been. And these are just people who live there, and they tell you things, and they say, oh, watch this video that people don't know about, but then I watch it. And then so I put together an article, and ended up meeting a police investigator, and that I think was a prelude to 9/11 because they used military grade explosives, I think, to bring down the Murrah building, and that's what they did with the building, Building 7. And because that is one of the mysteries of 9/11. How did the Building 7 collapse when the plane had hit the other buildings? And that appears to be a controlled demolition or using very high-grade military weaponry or explosives to bring it down. There's just so many things that there's the NORAD, that this happened to be the day of this military exercise, which was a way to throw off investigators.
The Timothy McVeigh bombing was on the day of the military
So
exercise?
there was also a military exercise on that day. So you start to see the patterns.
And there was a military exercise on 9/11 too?
Yeah, there was a major NORAD. So that throws off like some of the regular agencies,
You know what? Let me throw you one other thing. Apparently, it's been reported that when they planted all the bombs for the Nord Stream, that there was a military exercise, and they used that military exercise as cover, so that they would have ships in the area, and everybody would think it was just a normal part of the military exercise, and they used that to send everything down. And then apparently they were planning on just blaming it on the Russians, but that didn't go over so well. So they that was going to be a false flag that they blamed on the Russians, but that didn't go over so well either.
Yeah. So there are these patterns that you find when you study these incidents. And Peter Dale Scott, I recommend his writings. He's in his 90s now. He's a brilliant researcher. He's credited often with coining the term deep politics. And he has written numerous books like Deep Politics and the Death of JFK and Drugs, Oil, and War. And he also studies these patterns, and he calls them deep events. These are events that have a huge impact in changing the course of policy, whether it's the Kennedy assassination, the 9/11, and other maybe smaller level ones. So anyway, I recommend his books to listeners because he's a really sharp observer and analyst of American political affairs and the so-called deep state. There's so many things
I didn't know
on it, but there's the behavior of Bush and Cheney after, and there's unaccounted for time of where they were, and the official stories don't match. That's another sign, like when they're lying right away about what they're doing, where they are. Rumsfeld, Cheney. So some stuff with the 9/11, there's been a very effective cover-up. So there's a lot more questions than answers.
The 9/11 committee, kind of like the whatchamacallit committee in the JFK. There was a 9/11 committee. There was significant cover-ups there, wasn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. And I show that the Roberts Committee, you see the pattern is that after Pearl Harbor, they set up a commission called the Roberts Commission after a judge who was a friend of Franklin Roosevelt. And 10 years after, one of the members of the Roberts Commission, William F. Stanley, an admiral who had been ambassador to Moscow, said that was the most crooked investigation to that point in U.S. history. And he said that long after he retired. And then another naval admiral said that this was the most dishonest document ever by the U.S. government. But it set the groundwork. It was a complete cover-up. But then there were some other investigations into Pearl Harbor that actually disclosed certain key details, like Marshall admitted what I was saying about the scrambler phone and his foreknowledge. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a fact. He testified before another, not in the Roberts, because that covered it up. That didn't even I don't think Marshall was even asked to testify. But there were some other inquiries, including like a secret army hearing that was declassified some years later. And Marshall testified that he had the report of Pearl Harbor hours before. And then he gave this, like they were befuddled, and they asked him, why didn't you use the scrambler phone? And he gave this crazy answer. So that is actually documented in the historical record. It's not a conspiracy, but the Roberts Commission, preceded the Warren Commission as a totally corrupt commission that was set up just to whitewash it. And with the Warren Commission, some members of the commission said privately that it was totally corrupt. And in fact, one member, Hale Boggs, Louisiana congressman, he's the one who tipped off Jim Garrison, who was the New Orleans district attorney, that the Warren Commission was corrupt and that there was a conspiracy behind the JFK assassination. And then Hale Boggs died in a mysterious plane crash a few years later in Alaska. So it's a pattern,
What about the what was the congressman that everybody, he was a very progressive, anti-war congressman that pushed back, and he was up in Minnesota or something, and he died in a mysterious plane crash.
Paul Wellstone, yeah.
Paul Wellstone. I've heard people say that they felt that he was taken out also.
Yes, I did an article on that, and I credit James Fetzer. You might have him sometime on your show. He's a former Marine and a professor who has written numerous books investigating assassinations and what Scott would call deep politics. And I learned about the Wellstone case by picking up his book. He wrote a book on it, and he provided very good evidence that plane was sabotaged. And it was used, again, it was a sophisticated military operation, like I think Oklahoma City, like 9/11. These are very sophisticated military operations using very high-tech military weaponry that took down Wellstone's plane. And he was a key vote as far as the Iraq War. He was dissenting against the Iraq War, and they needed to get him out of there to go get the Congress behind the Iraq War. And his successor was a guy, Norm Coleman. Because of the plane crash, the Democrats lost the seat. A guy, Norm Coleman, who's like a pro-Bush Republican, got in, and Green, gave the vote for the pro-war. And Wellstone was a very progressive congressman, still beloved in the state of Minnesota. So it shows the depth of criminality of the deep state, and these high-level people, whether the Bushes or others. The evil knows no bounds. I mean,
how about this? The British, which the British are always involved in the in this skullduggery. They were having parliamentary discussions about whether or not to get involved in the Iraq War, and there was a guy by the name of I forgot his name. George Galloway did a show about him. Kelly, I think his name might have been, and he was an expert on weapons of mass destruction. And he was saying, look, there's no weapons of mass destruction. He was happy, the story. He was looking forward to doing something with his family. He was living his life, and then all of a sudden, he wandered out into the woods and cut his own wrist and killed himself. And I saw these studies that they said, how people like suicides. And they basically said, men never do that. That's something that like women do, number one. But here's the other thing. He cut his wrist, which means he committed suicide by bleeding to death, right? But there was no blood at the scene. So he cut his wrist, he bled to death. And I guess he cleaned up the blood. I don't know. But the bottom line is, and of course, he went for a walk in the woods, and which he didn't normally do. And well, guess what? Now all of a sudden he can't talk about the Iraq War. He can't make statements about weapons of mass destruction. And it sounds to me like the MI6. Which I might add, the MI6, the Mossad, and the CIA always work together, or often work together on this kind of stuff, right?
Well, that's true, yeah. And that goes back, like the Lusitania incident. That seems to have been driven by the British, and the Wilson administration went along, I think, because of Wilson's connection with J.P. Morgan. But I think the British were certainly at the forefront of that Black Flag operation. And then that was a crucial incident to get the U.S. Into World War I. It was invoked by Wilson when he gave a big speech. So it goes back, just to say, 100 years. And you see how in the U.S. Liberty incident, the U.S. and Israelis were cooperating. It was the U.S. really instructing the Israelis on what to do, because the U.S. was giving so much military support to the Israelis to enable them to take on their foe, the Egyptians. Because in '56 there was an important shift, because '56 Eisenhower actually pressured the Israelis and British and French to back off when they tried to invade Egypt after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Eisenhower pressured those countries to back off, and Eisenhower, I think, was the last president who had somewhat of an even-handed policy in the Middle East, at least with regard to Israel and Egypt and its foes. But that shifted under Kennedy, that the U.S. began delivering a lot of arms and supporting Israel unequivocally. And then Johnson was very, very tight with the Israelis and the so-called Israel lobby, as was Kennedy. So that was a turning point. And yeah, Angleton had helped develop the Israeli Mossad, and it's really an adjunct of the CIA, I think, that the Mossad.
Let me ask you this. It seems to me, I've seen articles that said that the SBU, the Ukrainian, there was an article in the New York Times that basically said the CIA, created the Ukrainian intelligence service, in its own image, that they had an entire floor on that, and that blah, blah, blah. And it seems to me that even like all of these attacks in Russia, and the Russians have come out and said, we know that MI6 was all over it, right? It seems to me, and I think they've also said something about the Mossad being all over it. So it seems to me that even Ukraine, what they do when they like take over a country or overthrow a country, they absorb whatever intelligence they have. Mm-hmm. And then they integrate it in the same way that after Germany, well, I don't know. I don't know if the U.S. absorbed Germany's intelligence organization, or it was the other way around. But there was some combination thereof. But that seems to me something that and this whole Five Eyes. That's, you know what I mean? The absorption, the integration of the CIA, the Mossad, the MI6 into spreading itself out like an evil spider web.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, with Germany, the Gehlen network was, he was the Nazi spy chief in the Soviet Union, and he was recruited by the CIA, and I think Frank Wisner and Alan Dulles under the Operation Paperclip and its successors, and they were running his agents to carry out clandestine operation behind the Iron Curtain, in the late 40s, early 1950s. So I think that gets at what you're saying, that they're absorbing. I mean, Gehlen had a huge network of agents working under him in Germany and Eastern European countries and in the Soviet Union. So, and he became a key figure in the early history of the CIA. And yeah, with Ukraine, they were recruiting these far right-wing elements in Ukraine who were Russophobes and many pro-Nazi, and that spills over to today. What you're saying, how they helped develop the SBU, around the mid-2010s, around the time of the Maidan coup. And yeah, the New York Times admitted that the CIA had 12 bases in Ukraine that they set up after that Maidan coup. And they've also reported on, wherever the CIA goes, it leaves a trail of violence and blood. I mean, the New York Times reported on assassinations being carried out by the SBU. Terror. Actually, it reported on these specialized units that were terrorists. I mean, and that's their word, because they were describing car bombings in cafes. Acts we would associate with terrorism, planting bombs in cars or civilian places. That's what they were doing, as described by the New York Times. And also The Economist had an article, and The Economist was worried that it was getting out of control. And it's all very reminiscent of the Phoenix program, where they set up, terrorist organization in South Vietnam, and they were targeting civilian officials. Like the New York Times article discussed how the victim of the car bombing were some mayors of towns that leaned to the Russian side. So they would bomb the car of the mayor, and they were bombing police stations in those small towns because they were pro-Russian or allying with the Russians. And that's similar to the Phoenix program, which was a CIA program using the South Vietnamese as proxies to murder civilian officials, because the National Liberation Front in that case had taken control of part of the country, and they also had set up shadow governments where they were really doing the real governing at night. The official government was not respected by the population, and under Phoenix, the civilians who were doing administrative work in towns or villages were among the key targets for assassination or terrorist acts. So it's very disturbing pattern. And I mean, there was outrage. I wrote a lot of articles about the Ukraine situation. Phoenix did generate a lot of public outrage. I mean, there was a stronger anti-war movement in the 60s and 70s than there was now. And they did, cast attention on Phoenix. There were some congressional hearings. There were some congressmen who were against it, who were trying to expose what was going on. I said that's what we need today. But unfortunately, there hasn't been much public outrage about that situation in Ukraine, which is horrific. And the anti-war forces have been entirely focused on the Middle East, which I think for good reason. However, this should be also on their radar.
One of the things that's important, and I would let me find this a book. So just so people know, when I was in law enforcement, I was assigned to this group by the work for the governor's office for the state of Maryland. It was after 2003 when they were trying to scare everybody all the time. Al Qaeda is going to get you, just so people know what happened, so they won't think I'm some kind of CIA agent. Which maybe they should think that. Don't trust anybody. That's a good idea. Just don't even trust me or Jeremy or anybody. Just suspect everybody. You're safe. But at any rate, so I got a lot of training on terrorism. And one of the training that we got was from this guy that was a former retired CIA agent. And we had to get training on VBIEDs, vehicular borne improvised explosive devices. In other words, car bombs. And I would tell everybody, read this book. It's called Buddha's Wagon: A Brief History of the Car Bomb. Why do I say that? And it's going to make sense to people in a second. The guy Buddha was a Mario Buddha, I think his name was. Anyway, he was pissed at Wall Street. He took a wagon, the old horse and buggy. He loaded it with explosives. He pulled it there, boom, and that was the first car bomb. But what you also learn is that Israeli groups in early Israel, there was a lot of Israeli terrorists, these Zionist terrorist groups. They're the ones that brought car bombs to the Middle East. The Israelis, the Israeli terrorist groups, but I repeat myself, brought a car bombing to the Middle East. They're like, oh, the Muslims are using car bombs. No, they're not the ones that brought it there. Why do I bring this up? Because one of the things that we've said, you're talking about, okay, the SBU and these groups using car bombs in Ukraine. What did the Israelis admit to recently? That a lot of the stuff that they said about their initial attack on Tehran was, oh, we had all these drones and all that. Actually, they didn't have as many. They had some shoulder-fired missiles, and they used a bunch of car bombs. So, as they all say, the chickens come home to roost. So now we're seeing Israel, which has become one gigantic terrorist group, right? The Israeli military going back to their roots and using car bombs against Tehran. And of course, the CIA and the Mossad was involved in that. Your thoughts, Jeremy?
Well, yeah, first, that is an excellent book. In fact, by Mike Davis, I have that book. And in fact, I used to teach a course on the history of terrorism at the University of Tulsa, and I assigned that book, and the students liked that book a lot because it was very well written, and it just laid out, well, it showed how it was not pro-terrorist by any means, but it tried to explain that, look, this is the poor man's Air Force, and terrorism, usually takes root among oppressed groups It usually
I would put it like this: the weaker people you are the ones that are going to use the terrorism. The stronger
yeah.
they are, the less likely they are to have
Yeah.
the
So I mean, the solution is to address the underlying political grievance, but unfortunately, that never happens. And relate to the Israelis. Yeah, they have a very good. Davis had, and I think he's passed away, but he was a great writer. He wrote a lot of good books. He wrote a great book on Los Angeles and its kind of underbelly. And yeah, the chapter on Israel, I do remember about that. He discussed this V Irgun. I mean, that's the origin. The tragedy of Israeli politics is that these hardline extremists came to dominate the Israeli state. It is V Irgun Leumi terrorist group. They even targeted the British. They bombed the King David Hotel.
Yep.
Menachem Begin was a member of that group, and then he became the Israeli prime minister in the 80s, and that's a forerunner of the modern Likud party, Netanyahu's party. I mean, there had been more moderate elements, and there was a labor left that's been wiped out. They had leaders who were more on the left side, more moderate. There was, I think, one good leader in Israel was Moshe Sharet. He was actually trying to avert conflict, and they actually set him up. The Israelis mastered false flag because Sharet was like trying to make peace with the Arabs, and he was not a racist, toward the Arab people. He wanted respect and Israel to coexist. They set him up in the false flag incident to undermine him. Like they carried out this false flag incident in Egypt to try and trigger a war and kind of undermine Sharet, make him look weak. I forget all the details. It was called the Lavon affair. I'd have to double check all the detail, but I recall it was designed to foment a war with Egypt and undermine Sharet because he was actually trying to create peace with the Arabs and felt that was the pathway to Israeli security, but not to be constantly aggressive. Like the Likud belief was that the Jews can only have security if they crush their enemies. And they had this really racist attitude toward the Arabs, and unfortunately, they came to dominate. Sharet, through skullduggery, they removed him, and the liberal left in Israel got eviscerated, and you have just these right-wing aggressive elements who have their roots in that terrorism of the 40s, including terrorism directed against British elements who they felt were not moving fast enough to advance their cause.
Well, and I think it's important to talk about this right now because to me, when I look at the history of false flags, there's one of two things going, and that is they got an idea and they want to move in a particular direction, and so they need they need an impetus, they need some public relations to get people interested. The other is this, and this is where we are right now. I looked 16% approval rating for overall 16% approval rating for actually going to war with Iran, right? Trump's taking heat. MAGA people are left and right are saying, hey, we didn't vote for this. Well, this is if you could ever talk about fertile ground for a false flag, let's remember 1991, when they wanted to go into Iraq and Kuwait and all of that stuff, and they had a very low approval rating for that action. And what did they do? They did the Iraqis are throwing throwing babies out of incubators, and that was a pure false flag. And they got the support up to 60%, and they went in.
Yeah. Well, and I also, the Pearl Harbor, because Roosevelt had campaigned on the slogan in 1940. He said, American boys will never be sent into another world war. You had to have something spectacular like a Pearl Harbor that he would reverse himself. And there's question marks about this incident at the embassy where this left-wing guy supposedly shot these two Israeli staffers. There's some questionable things emerging, whether that was manipulated. And I don't know all the facts in that case, but given the history, it wouldn't surprise me because, they want to label the pro-Palestine protesters as anti-Semitic. and all of a sudden you have an incident that would seemingly corroborate, oh yes, they are anti-Semitic. You have this pro-Palestine guy who shot these innocent kids who were Israelis or had some affiliation with the Israeli embassy. But the facts seem a bit strange around that whole incident. So I would suggest that need more investigation as to whether that is some kind of false flag. I don't know, or whether this guy. I mean, we know, as far-fetched as it sounds, and that's why, yeah, I could understand if the average person thinks or conspiracy theories or something, but when you study the history, truth is stranger than fiction. And the CIA, and we discussed on this show, they use mind control. They've gone back with the MK Ultra for decades. They've done mind control experiments that they can program people. They can program assassins. The CIA psychologists have even bragged that we can create an assassin in 2 months. They've said this. This is not that I'm a conspiracy theorist. They said it. And we know that Sirhan was hypnotized and was set up as a patsy. He likely fired blanks. He wasn't RFK shooters. So, and that's one case. There's the John Lennon case. There's very strong evidence. There's a new book by a British journalist that makes clear he was targeted under MK Ultra and groomed, and that he was not the shooter, Mark David Chapman. There was another shooter, but he was set up as the patsy, and he had been hypnotized. So when you know that pattern, you have to be suspicious about certain incidents, especially if things look a bit fishy, as this one is starting to look a bit fishy because they can't find any background on these people who were killed. There were no funerals. There were no friends coming out, family. There's just some
How about this? How about this? The guy who from Butler, Pennsylvania, that they shot, and he was like 22. He had nothing online. A 22-year-old that wasn't online doing anything. That you find him in a BlackRock commercial a couple years ago, and you're like, what the hell is that? How many people are in a BlackRock commercial, right? How about this? There was a guy who shot up a gay bar in Florida, and we found out that I think both him and his father had been FBI, like it worked for the FBI, right? You remember that? I think it was Tampa that shot up a gay bar and killed a bunch of people. And his, and it's like they're always connected.
And the Trump shooter, Ryan Ralph, I did a background on him. I just read into him. He was a mercenary in Ukraine, and he wrote a book that was advanced all these CIA talking points. Like, he presents himself as this kind of anti-Trump hippie type, and then he throws in the line out of the blue, but Zelensky had to delay the elections. And then it's like, there's another line in there. I actually read this whole book. It was one of the strangest books I ever read. And it clear this somebody either put him up to this or somebody else wrote it. And then they insert
to make him look crazy. You write that to make it look like he's crazy, so that you can later use him. Yeah,
exactly. But then they insert these CIA talking points. So that's the telltale sign of an intelligence operation. Because why would he say, but Zelensky had to delay the election? And he's supposedly this like hippie anti-war, anti-Trump guy. And then he's like, Lena Boulard is a great leader. That's the leader the CIA was promoting in Peru, nobody knows her, but she's actually was voted one of the most unpopular leaders in the world and was charged with genocide. And yet he has no connection to Peru. He just inserts a line, she's a great leader. And
his wife. Did you see all the stuff about his wife? That she was supposedly connected to the CIA front company, and everybody was bringing it up. And the CIA front company that was in Virginia, 6 miles from CIA headquarters.
Yeah.
And the company would never say anything. They were like, "Hey, it's like," and he said, "My wife pays for all it." He had no visible means of income, and he said, "Oh yeah, my wife pays for everything." And everybody's like, "Oh, what's this? Well, oh God, she worked for the CIA front company." They never said a word. And one other thing,
you don't hear about that case anymore.
What happened to him? Is he even being prosecuted?
I don't know. And that's the thing. Yeah. So I mean, this could all be, it's a strategy of tension, because that's what Scott and others have written about. They put the public on edge with these and constantly in fear, and that's how they ramp up the police state measures. And so.
And the one last thing, there was a bombing. It might have been in an area, I might have it wrong, in England. I think it might have been Manchester. It might have been an Area Grande concert or something, this concert. And there were these bombings. And when they find out who they were, Middle Eastern people who were, whatever, supposed terrorists, right? But then they find out that these guys had been over in Syria and Libya or wherever, and that MI6 had transported these people back and forth from the Middle East, and now they suddenly show up at a concert and they're suicide bombers. And I'm thinking, that seems to be pretty consistent. Why is it that all the suicide bombers were always involved? All of these people were always involved. Like I said, the guy shoots up a gay bar. Hey, what's going on? Did he hates gay people? Well, his father was an FBI informant. And you're like, every single time? And we're the crazy conspiracy theorists?
Yeah, so.
Well, thank you very much once again, Jeremy Kuzmarov. Let me show you the important website, all of the stuff that we're talking about. CovertAction Magazine. One of the things we were talking about today was State of Israel. Lyndon B. Johnson deliberately murdered 34 American sailors in 1967. Fabricated massive cover-up still in effect after 55 years. That is, of course, the USS Liberty. Of course, you can go to CovertActionMagazine.com. All kinds of stuff going on here. You see that they cover all kinds of stuff. Wait a minute, we even go with that. Einstein down here. Einstein opposed Zionist colonization and predicted the current catastrophe. So there's a lot going on at CovertActionMagazine.com. As you can see, Jeremy and his people there are on top of all of this stuff. One of my favorite places to go and learn on the net. And this is an absolutely fantastic conversation. Jeremy comes on every Friday morning at 10:30, and we have these great conversations. Please make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. Additionally, follow me on Rockfin and Rumble and Instagram and all Patreon, all that kind of stuff. If you can afford it, donate at PayPal or buy me a coffee or something like that. You see all the other stuff. And of course, I got my P.O. We got Cash App, all that, but I got my P.O. box now, and you can send me whatever you want. If you want to send a donation, if you want to send just a letter that you want to write out or type out, if you want to send a book or a magazine, there is my P.O. box. Thanks a lot, everybody. Don't forget, follow Jeremy. And as I always say, everybody in the chat right now, there's been like 600 and some people, right? Make sure you like this video. But here's what's important. You're the biggest part of this, what do you call it? This alternative media. Is that the right word? Sphere. Share this. If you like this video, or if you find any of these videos that you like, make sure you share them on all your social media platforms. Thanks a lot. We're out.